Welcome to Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Hayes Davis, and my guest today is Nate Marshall. Nate, it's good to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to jump right in. It's 2024, so we're only 4 years out from COVID, from hard COVID, as I've heard it called. People refer to COVID, though, in the past tense. Has it truly passed for you? If not, what's the psychic residue? And I'd also love to know, did the pandemic change your writing in any lasting or temporary ways?
For me, COVID is a thing that I don't know if it's the kind of thing that can end. It has a million different sort of ripples. And it absolutely has changed my writing. I don't know if it's changed necessarily my approach, but I suspect perhaps it has in ways that I just haven't fully compassed because I know it has really addled or really messed with certain things. My ability to focus was just decimated in the pandemic, right? And so that is a thing that I'm sitting with and I'm sure is reflecting itself in the poems and just trying to rebuild that sense of focus, that sense of stillness, that sense of sort of being okay to unplug and sort of find a kind of mental space, a sort of mental clarity. But I think in terms of content, right? A lot of the poems I've been writing recently have really been in the mode of both elegy and love poem, and that for me is so much that's just because the last 4 or 5 years, those two modes have been just indelibly imprinted on my life, right? And I think a lot of our lives, right? Because I think one thing that COVID did, obviously there was a lot of death, a lot of sickness, et cetera, right? And so the elegy piece, that sense of mourning, right, was, I think, so prescient and remains so. But also for me, I got engaged in 2020, and then we didn't tell people for a year because it felt like such a weird time.
Yeah.
To be sort of celebratory in that way.
Yeah.
Also, we just quite literally didn't know when or how we could have a wedding, and so it was well, no need to rush. I never thought about myself as intending to have a long engagement, but that was just sort of. It became a 2-year engagement just because it took 2 years to sort of figure out how calm things were going to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's definitely reshaped, my life, all of our lives, our sense of writing. And for me, one of the things I started writing all of these poems about mourning in particular because so much of the kind of mourning rituals that I was accustomed to really have been kind of stripped away, right? It became harder to gather with people. That became, and in some ways remains, a thing that is heightened, right? And that is really complicated, right? And I don't know if I realized just how important that sense of ritual was for me until the pandemic and its sort of myriad afterlives.
You talked about content. I find myself writing more. I find myself looking at the sky more. I don't know if it's more than I did before COVID, but I like looking at the sky, appreciating nature, appreciating Terry. You may know is a great gardener, and so one of the things that happened, one of the things that got us through, was every couple of weeks there's new flowers coming up. Right. So it's the daffodils, and then it was the tulips, and then it was the I forget all the names, but that was such a huge thing for us. Yeah. And I think for me, nature was getting outside. I was going to sort of joke when you talked about the engagement. I'm like, well, you're going to figure out if it's really meant to be if you're in the house together 24/7.
We said that. We were like, well, we know we really actually like each other because there's no we go on trips and do all these sort of adventures. The adventure is us kicking it.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
And you really do figure out, this is someone that I really can talk to every day with no other real distraction.
Yeah. If we go back a little bit before that, because some folks who are watching the show might be new to you. So let's think about the mid-2010s.
Sure.
You had edited an anthology, The Breakbeat Poets.
Sure, absolutely.
You dropped an album. You dropped a first book. For people watching, as I said, who are new to you, if they read Wild Hundreds, listened to Grown, read the Breakbeat Poets, which Nate Marshall would they meet? And could you pick a poem from Wild? We have a copy of Wild Hundreds here. Could you pick a poem that for you captures your voice in that moment?
Oh my God. So I guess if you do those three, so I will sometimes talk or think about Wild Hundreds as a kind of coming of age album, similar to like, I think there's a long tradition of this in music, and certainly in like hip hop, right? So I think of Illmatic as a version of that. I think of Good Kid, Mad City, right? What have you? College Dropout.
I was just about to say, kind of.
No, absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And so for me, like, Wild Hundreds is kind of that sort of thing, and I think that's also true of the record of Grown, because we were. That's an album. We started it. Me and my homeboy Lamar, our rap group Daily Lyrical Product. Like we made a couple albums in high school, and we're like selling them hand to hand on State Street downtown Chicago, like doing that whole, like very sort of now a very antiquated model of like being an underground rapper.
Right. Yeah.
But I think once we got, and then we kind of graduated, and we're in college, and learning how to be people in the world for real. And it took us like 5 years to make that record. And so that album is basically like the very end of our teens and our early 20s. And I think that's part of why we named it Grown, because we were sort of like, we're like, that is the album. The record is really figuring out, what does adulthood mean? What is it like? And there's a kind of reckoning in it that is sort of now, with the experience of it being nearly a decade ago, is like kind of sweet and kind of endearing. But, and then Breakbeat Poets, I think, certainly for me, was such a learning experience, right? Like that happened before my book. In many ways, I was sort of like the kind of like young, hungry dude of the three editors, right? And it was absolutely, I think, a deep, deep learning experience. And it was an experience that grew me up, right? That taught me a lot about what it meant to be a literary citizen, what it meant to be a writer in the world, and how I wanted to do that, and also how I didn't want to do that.
How much work goes into it.
Yeah, and how much work goes into it, right? And what it means to have relationships, to be a good steward of those, and also sometimes to end them. So I think for me, man, if I had to... So yeah, I think that there is a real through line between all those things for me, and it's really just like that sort of process of going from kind of young, starry-eyed kid to not someone who has it figured out, but someone who is like more approaching like a more real embodied adulthood, I guess. Yeah.
Is there something from Wild Hundreds that you want to share?
Yeah, let me read something. All right. So, all right. Yeah, I'll read this. This is called Recycling. It's your first year of college, and you should be missing home by now, but mostly you don't. You read the Chicago newspapers and call family on Sundays. You pick up going to a church in a place adjacent to the projects. You're not from projects, and the ones in Chicago seem worse, but there's comfort in being around plain-spoken folk. The church folk feed you and also cook you food. You take African American studies classes and sleep through Spanish and write poems at night. You read the newspaper. You consider pledging a fraternity. You go to parties to watch people. You don't miss home. You call your ex-girl a lot. You imagine her face across the phone line. You stare at the scar on her chin. It is shiny and smooth. You read the newspaper. You text new girls mostly. You invite them to play cards and bet clothes, or take them to dinner on your birthday so you don't spend it alone, or you share their extra long twin beds, or you just text them. It's your first year of college and your nephew is tiny and your niece is young enough to be happy and the world is new. And you are not going home for Thanksgiving. You are in the South at a new friend's house. You go to church with his family and to his old high school's basketball game and to his malls and to his grandmother's house. You did not make your team past 9th grade and never went to malls much. Your grandmother has been dead for 2 years now. You read the newspaper. His family are nice people. You do not miss home. You go back to school. You stop talking to your ex-girl. She has a new guy. You do not miss home. You write poems. You read the newspaper. There are still more kids dying. Your first year of college, and you should be missing, but you're still here. You write poems about black people and voting and violence and families, and that is the same poem. You don't read the newspaper. You have finals to finish. You go to church on Sunday with your new friend, and you talk to girls and consider pledging. You have heard the fraternities will haze you. You have heard about beating, but you are not from the projects and you are not in Chicago. You stop reading the newspaper. You decide to kiss a girl and mean it. You decide to pledge a fraternity. You should have more information about the newspaper and the girl and the fraternity. You should call home more. You don't read newspapers or call. You are not from the projects or Chicago. You do not miss home or your ex-girl or your newspaper. There are still more kids dying. You convince your new friend to pledge the fraternity. He worries about the hazing, the beatings. You tell him this is opportunity. Don't miss it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I have so many things bubbling in my head right now. Number one, I hear shades of Finna in that, because that search for the self, that processing the self, the growth of the self. Also, what struck me, because I've done this in my own work, that the use of the second person you.
Yeah.
I've done it. So I did it in a poem about my dad. I wrote a lot about my dad in my first book. So it's a poem about seeing him fall for the first time. But I used you to keep that emotional distance and not sentimentalize it too much. What does the you mean for you in poetry? Yeah,
that's a good question. There's something I like about the you in that it sort of implicates the reader. Like it pulls, they become a kind of character in the thing. Also, like for me, whenever I think about that second person, I think of, I think it's Jamaica Kincaid's Girl.
Yes.
And then also the last story, I think it's a title story in Junot Diaz's This Is How You Lose Her, which, I'm pretty sure I wrote this poem in graduate school, like as I was sort of working on the thesis that became this book. And that book came out around that time, and so I was reading it and like thinking a lot about it. I don't know. There's something that I find helpful about implicating the reader, but maybe that's like, I'm thinking, I'm like, do I trust that impulse, or am I trying to like keep from implicating myself? Like,
keep a distance from it.
Maybe like both things, yes and, right?
And it's also, it seems to me, a way to invite the reader to take someone else's perspective.
Sure.
Right.
And I think to think about what some of these things may not be strictly true of your experience, right? Maybe you're not from Chicago, you didn't go to college, or whatever, but you're like, okay, what was a moment in my life where I was undergoing a transition, being told this transition is opportunity, is a thing to sort of run towards, is a thing to embrace, and I'm also having these like really complicated feelings about that thing, right? Like, because I think everyone probably has some moment like that, large or small, right? Yeah.
I lived mostly with my mom right before college. My parents split when I was 3.
Okay.
And so I lived with my mom right before college. We had some of the biggest fights that summer.
Oh,
because it's that separation anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
For sure. So how did your voice grow in the years between Wild Hundreds and Finna?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest thing, probably between the two books, is that I think in Wild Hundreds there is a kind of impulse to make the speaker who is like closest to me, right? To me, or the version of me who was writing those poems or who was living some of the scenarios or whatever. I think there's an impulse to make that character heroic in Wild Hundreds that I certainly understand, and I don't think is like a evil impulse or a negative impulse. But I think with Finna, I really wanted to trouble that. I really wanted to like, maybe rather than implicate the audience or implicate the reader, implicate the self, and in doing so, maybe also implicate other people, but really like to do some kind of like wrestling with oneself and thinking about like, what does it mean to tell a story where I don't come off like looking like the good guy? Not that there isn't always a good guy or bad guy, or whatever, but what happens when it's more complicated? What happens when it's more messy?
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways the growth was like being uncomfortable or embracing some of that messiness in a different kind of way.
If you haven't read Clint Smith's new book, Above Ground, yet.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Number one, as a new parent, I'm going to ask about it in a second. But number two, I'm thinking two things. I'm thinking, first of all, that if you haven't had it already, you're about to have people amazed that you're out with your kid and the mother's not. Have you had that yet?
Yeah,
I had this woman at Giant just come over. I'm in the parking lot, right? The kids are in the car. I don't need help. I'm loading groceries. She comes over and starts loading the groceries. They got you babysitting. These are my kids. I'm a teacher, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about Clint Smith, who writes that poem, Gold Stars, about getting that praise all the time and sort of what's behind that. And I'm thinking about you wanting to trouble the hero thing. And I feel like in my new manuscript, I'm pushing past those gold stars. I'm talking about the ways that I was a parent that I wish I could go back and change. So I'm just thinking about all of that. Hearing you talk about Finna.
Well, Clint's the homie. Like we sort of, I think we first met over a decade ago now. We were both like hella young, kind of just out of college. And I think we met in DC like at like a youth poetry slam or something that we were both sort of helping run or work. And we just had dinner last night.
Oh, cool.
So, but when that book came out, he was like running around the country doing a sort of whirlwind tour, and he came through Madison, and this was right kind of, I think, early when I found out Allison was pregnant, and me and him did the sort of conversation event thing for Above Ground, and after the way I was like, hey man, them dad poems hit a little differently. That was like how I told him, like, oh, she's pregnant. And he was like, oh, what? Yeah. So,
Oh, that ode to the couch.
Sure.
I love that.
Oh, sure.
I love that.
Absolutely.
The cereal dust on the pant leg.
Yeah.
You have a new baby. You got a 5-month-old.
Yes.
And you're married to a poet.
Yes.
So I know a little bit about both of those things.
Absolutely.
What is married to a poet to you, and how is fatherhood evolving you?
Well, I feel like I should ask you this. You're like the expert. I need to. Are you teaching a class or something? Can we do a seminar? No. I think it's interesting, right? I feel like I think sometimes, especially in kind of Western culture, there's a lot of hang-ups about poetry and maybe just writing more broadly or making art more broadly as a kind of solitary endeavor. And there certainly is an endeavor that requires solitude at certain times. But I think also like one thing for me, and this comes from like maybe coming to the art as a young person, doing a lot of poetry slams, open mics, this kind, just like, is that for me, like art was never a solitary practice, and I was never attracted to art as a solitary practice. And so in a lot of ways, it feels really natural to me to have a home life and a kind of life partner or a sort of romantic partner who also like shares in that like artistic piece of things, right? And with that said, like me and Allison are like deeply different people. We write deeply different kinds of poems. And so we certainly have like a lot of shared interests and a lot of shared real estate, and like can talk about work, can deal with each other's work, but we don't. But I feel like there's still enough space that we don't feel like we crowd each other out. And I find that sometimes it's nice to not have to sort of do that kind of translation that you do when you're talking to kind of literary civilians.
Oh yeah.
You can just sort of be like, I need to like be wild in a room alone for like 2 hours just to like make this thing happen. And she's like, whatever. Like you don't even have to, you just, there's some shorthands that I think develop that are.
Absolutely.
Really great.
Absolutely. We'd be at the dining room table, and one or the other of us would suddenly grab a piece of paper and a pen and start scribbling.
Yeah.
And the other would notice. Like if it was Terry, I'm like, okay, I'm doing bedtime, right? It just there's that unspoken, you just know, and I think that there's a reverence that Terry and I have for each other and for each other's work, which, like you and Allison, our work is very different, and that's part of why the relationship works. Also, and I say this all the time, we feel no need, nor would we feel it was responsible for either of us to pump the other up if the poem wasn't working.
Sure.
I'd be like, I love this, sweetie, but can you push that further?
Sure.
Or she'll be like, this is great, but how about you end with an image instead of just telling us something?
Yeah.
So it's nice.
No, absolutely.
It's nice.
I mean, the other thing, because you asked about like how parenthood is sort of shifted. The thing about like a little kid is they don't do much, and they also like do everything. And it really makes you, like you really are attentive to details in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
And I've always both thought and taught that like that is the thing out of which poetry emerges, right? Like poetry is the noticing discipline, right?
Yeah.
What Miss Brooks says, poetry is life distilled.
Yeah.
And what is distillation but a kind of focusing, a kind of getting down to a thing's core elements, right? Removing all the sort of superfluous. And so maybe it's making me a better poet. Hopefully it's definitely making me a more like sleepy poet, a poet that has like less time for the poem.
Yep.
And so,
Yep. The first residency I did after they were born, I did Manhattanville over a weekend. It was the
sure.
It was the Cave Canem, and so Patricia Smith was teaching it. I met Ty Freedom Ford.
Oh, very good.
And I was so prolific that weekend because I knew I had a weekend.
Yeah.
And it was a generative workshop. But I started to appreciate residency time it's funny because I never went to a residence. Well, no, I'm sorry. I went to a few residencies before they were born. But after they were born, right, you just value every minute of every hour of every day.
I'm going to my first one like this coming week.
Nice.
And again, you really need to teach a seminar because I'm taking notes, bro. I'm learning.
Yeah. Let's go back to the self for a second. In the first poem from Finna, you talk directly to a white supremacist named Nate Marshall, right? That whole thing about the self in ways that speculates about what you might share, maybe some elements of shared humanity.
Sure.
In a world where some people struggle with perspective taking, right? That's why I mentioned it earlier. What made you imagine those connections between you and this other, or one of the other Nate Marshalls that are out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think. I mean, one of the things is like I wrote that poem in a very particular moment in my life. I was starting my sort of teaching career in earnest. I was teaching at a small liberal arts college in kind of rural Indiana. I would call it quite literally the middle of nowhere because we were about an hour west of Indianapolis, an hour east of the University of Illinois, and about 45 minutes south of Purdue. So literally if you draw a triangle between those three places where we were like right there in the middle. Ezra Pound, I think, taught there for not even a full school year, got kicked out and called it the sixth circle of hell.
Wow.
And so, it was a weird place. It was a weird, very specific place. But one of the things I noticed is like at that school, a lot of my students were like pretty working class. A lot were first generation students. But like, it was interesting because like a fair chunk of them were sort of like white Indiana farm boys who coming into Crawfordsville, Indiana thought, oh, this is the big city because there's more than one type of church. This is like the most diverse place I've been by a wide margin. And then then there's like a set of like Chicano kids who are from like South Texas who end up at this school because there's sort of a pipeline that had developed. And then there's these like Black and Latino kids from like Indianapolis and the sort of Chicago suburbs up in like Northwest Indiana, kind of around Gary. And so, you know, it's very easy when you take those multiple populations to see all the things they don't have in common, but there's also like a lot of stuff they really shared, right? That they really connected on and connected with. And this is also a men's college, right? And so that was also like really coloring it. And so I think I was particularly in a place where I was looking for that kind of commonality. I should also say too that like that year, this was the 2015-2016 school year.
Okay.
And so it's like a particularly interesting time to be teaching in like sort of West Central, like pretty rural, pretty conservative Indiana as the kind of rise of Donald Trump is also happening, and seeing students in my class come in and be like, and have like Trump stickers on their computer and be like, Professor Marshall, like, you're my favorite professor, I'm rocking with you. And be like, oh, okay, like, people are just more complicated than a lot of the kind of silos in which we want to put them in, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Would you mind reading that poem?
Sure.
Cool.
Oh, let's see. Nate Marshall is a white supremacist from Colorado, or Nate Marshall is a poet from the south side of Chicago, or I love you, Nate Marshall. When I first made my name Nate, I was a boy at summer camp looking for cool in the muggy shadow. And so when the white boy snipped Nathaniel to just a touch of the tongue to the mouth roof, it seemed to me a religious moment, a new confirmation as okay. This was 2000, and you must have been Nate Marshall for decades by then. I find you, years later, buried in a Google search and follow you silently for the next year like a high school crush. I tell my students about you, the day when we wonder what if privilege hadn't put us in a college classroom. I tell my ex about you in bed, and it's convenient that there's this other Nate Marshall to be the liar, lying there this time. I see your failed campaign and watch how your ties to white supremacists spelled your demise. My Black History Month paper on the Black Panthers in third grade wouldn't color me radical enough, and I am ashamed. I've never been pushed out of a spotlight for loving my people too much. Your day job is roofing, and I just watch HGTV in hotels. You are the truer amongst us, Nate. You, peddler of propaganda and seller of shingles. Can you show me how to love what you love? Every time I've said, what's good, nigga? It's possible we've matched our mouths symmetrical around the two G's in the middle. I won't lie to you, Nate Marshall, or to myself, Nate Marshall. I too have hated a nigga and lived to tweet the tale. I too have sat suspicious in my basement, wondering who was coming for my country. I too have Googled myself and found a myself I despise. Once you left Twitter after I told my people to tell you that they loved you and your book and your commitment to Black people. And I feel you, Nate Marshall. I've left places and loves when they told me they loved a Nate Marshall I didn't recognize.
That's, wow. Wow. Thank you for that. I love the way you're exploring the self in your work. That's so engaging. Thank you for being here.
Appreciate you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Hayes Davis. This is Nate Marshall. Have a great day.